It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the ineluctable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
I'm absolutely excellent. How are you doing today, Andy?
Great. Great. We were just talking about, after being inundated with a blizzard yesterday about, sledding down a hill and, having winter sports and then going inside, sitting by the fire, sipping our cocoa and everything. So, winter has its own beauty, doesn't it, John?
Yeah, this storm is really come at a great time. I hear it's supposed to warm up and we're gonna lose all this snow, and maybe I'll be grilling outside in the backyard on Christmas. We'll see. But right now it's
Yeah,
gorgeous and
well,
I'm definitely in the spirit.
yeah, well, warm up, it's global warming, it's
Yeah.
gonna, according to, I think it was some British scientists, who predicted this roughly 15, 20 years ago, said snow in the UK was going to be a very rare event. And then last year they had snow in like the first half of November. But be that as it may, yesterday was December 17th, and that's a major anniversary of a major event, gigantic event in the history of aviation. We discussed the great Chuck Yeager last week, and now we're going back to the roots of aviation today. Are we not? Who we got on tap for our audience today, John?
We got the Wright brothers today, Wilbur and Orville Wright, first in flight. And December 17th, 1903 was the anniversary, 117 years ago, that the Wright brothers first flew a motorized aircraft. Pretty amazing story. And,
Yeah.
there's all sorts of interesting questions like how in the world did these two bicycle entrepreneurs become the first to do this when there were people and scientists and engineers all over the world that were attempting to do this? And of course, people had wanted to fly since ancient times, and medievals had wanted to do it. Leonardo da Vinci studied the problem. And how did these two guys do it? So I'm just thrilled by this story. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, absolutely right. Bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. One of them, I think it was Wilbur, completed 4 years of high school, although he didn't get his diploma because the family moved. Orville dropped out of high school after his junior year. He only had 3 years of high school. So these guys, their formal schooling was severely delimited. Like you said, they were engineers all over the world. Real quality guys working on this problem. And and these two guys who were self-educated in aeronautical engineering, they're the ones who resolved it. It's a great story. It's a great American story, and I think we should before we get started on it, I just wanted to put in a plug for Henry Ford, one of their contemporaries. Have you been to Greenfield Village in the Detroit suburbs, John?
I've not been. No,
Well,
I'd love to.
yeah, I strongly recommend it. Has anything been published in TOS about Henry Ford's museum at Greenfield Village? Have we
I don't
plugged
know
it at
about the
all?
museum. I wrote a little piece about Ford and his thoughts on income inequality, and he thought it was a good thing. It reflected the facts. It was just, and that got some flack because people were like, well, Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent or something like that, published these very racist or rather or anti-Semite comments. So, but I'm a huge fan of Ford nonetheless. I think that's obviously a blot on his character and his record. But we'd
Right,
love to have an
right, and
article on the Greenfield Village.
yeah, well, we'll discuss Ford on the Hero Show because after all, he's the guy who revolutionized personal transportation, ground transportation. We got to say, since we're discussing the Wright brothers, revolutionized personal ground transportation first in the U.S. and then around the world. By the way, because I'm getting to Greenfield Village for a reason, but my good friend, actually my sister, Amy Nasa, Robert and Amy Nasa, really family to me. Works at Greenfield Village. She knows a lot about Henry Ford, and she pointed out to me when we were discussing this about Ford's anti-Semitic rants, and he that's true. It's real. And when we acknowledge heroes' flaws, and we will when we do Henry Ford, we will acknowledge those flaws. But Amy Nasa pointed out to me one of his closest friends, one of Henry Ford's closest friends, was a rabbi, and two, he had no problem hiring Jews as executives at Ford Motor Company. So there's something a little strange about that story. But Greenfield Village is it's an American treasure. I recommend everybody go there. My sister Amy Nasa worked there. I think still works there. She loves it. Here's the thing. First of all, about the Wright brothers, Henry Ford bought the real deal. He didn't have a replica. I mean, he bought the Wright brothers' home in Dayton, Ohio, and shipped it up, to Greenfield Village, outside Detroit. And he bought their bicycle shop with their workroom in the back and their wind tunnel, and everything. And so you go there and you're standing. It's roped off, but you're standing like 5 feet from the space where in the actual, not the space, because the space was in Ohio and now you're in Michigan, but the actual building, the actual workroom where the Wright brothers conducted their experiments, and you're 5 feet from this history. Also, Ford was a close personal friend of Thomas Edison and a great admirer of Edison. He bought Edison's workshop in Menlo Park, New Jersey, shipped that out, to Greenfield Village. I remember Edison wanted the Menlo Park, the Wizard of Menlo Park. Edison's another guy we have to do, John. Edison wanted the workshop to remain on New Jersey soil, so Henry Ford shipped out like tons of soil from New Jersey to put Edison's workshop there. And then again, you're standing like, it's roped off, but you're standing like 5 feet from Edison's workbench where he worked on the electric lighting system. It's just, I salute Henry Ford for a number of reasons, and this is one. Anybody who's a student of technology, or just the great moments in American history, strongly recommend Greenfield Village, and certainly for the Wright brothers. So here we are. We should get some dates, right? Let me put on my glasses because I feel more heroic when I can read.
Professor Bernstein with his glasses on.
Yeah, it's easier to read when I got my reading glasses on. So Wilbur was 1867 to 1912. Died tragically young. Was it typhoid fever? Was it? I think.
Yeah, typhoid.
Yeah, typhoid. Thank God for modern medicine, we don't have these kind of diseases still roaming around, and we have a vaccine coming for COVID, which is a great thing. Let's hear it for the American pharmaceutical companies, right? For Pfizer, and Orville's dates 1871 to 1948. So we are late 19th century America, turn of the 20th century America, of course. And so you raised the good questions. How did these, self-educated, how did these bicycle mechanics who were self-educated in aeronautical engineering solve the problem of the ages that all of these great engineers, and really great aviators, Samuel Langley, Otto Lilienthal, Cobb Chanute, people like that were working on it, but it was the Wright brothers that solved it. How did they do it? There's the big question for the day, right?
Yeah, and you brought up the age too, and I think this plays a role as well. And this was a time you mentioned Ford. Lots of people were working on automobiles and perfecting that, but there was Eastman and the Kodak company, and Singer with Merritt Singer doing the sewing machines, and there was also the National Cash Register company right there in Dayton. So it was a time of great innovation, and nonetheless, flying was seen as this just absolutely ridiculous dream that was never going to come to fruition. And lots of people belittled the idea that it was ever going to happen, but that did not at all deter the Wright brothers and lots of other people from pursuing it. But they did it. How? And I think we should talk first about their interesting childhood. This has
you mentioned the era, the time period. Let me just say something about that before we get into the Wright's childhood. American historians, as you know, have dubbed it, borrowing a phrase from Mark Twain, have dubbed this period the Gilded Age, as though, you know, business and or political corruption was the defining essence of the age. Whereas you pointed out the enormous amount of innovation. I mean, this was the era in which Thomas Edison, late 19th century, I mean, he invented the phonograph, he invented the incandescent light bulb, then electric lighting system to first illuminate New York City and then, around the world. This was around the country and then around the world. This was the era of Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone. This was when Chicago in the 1870s and 1880s, the first skyscrapers were being built. William LeBaron Jenney, Louis Sullivan. It was a seething cauldron of invention. George Eastman, like you said, in photography. Also, we can't forget Nikola Tesla. Serbian immigrant, comes to the United States, goes into business with George Westinghouse, perfects the AC induction mode, and they proceed to win the battle of the currents against Edison, and generate electricity across the vastness of the North American continent. And by the way, I don't know if you've seen the film The Current War, but I strongly recommend it. Benedict Cumberbatch as Thomas Edison, Michael Shannon as George Westinghouse. Was it who played Tesla? Was it Nicholas Poole? Is that his name? I forget.
Bad with actor name. Couldn't tell you.
Yeah, but the great thing about The Current War, John, and everybody, is it shows all of Edison's flaws, as we do on the Hero Show, and we will when we discuss Edison. He was profoundly mistaken on the AC/DC, controversy, and he did perpetrate all kinds of dirty tricks to try to discredit, Westinghouse and Tesla. And the movie shows all that. It's honest. And yet it never loses its reverence for Edison's genius, right? I mean, it never loses it always maintains its reverence for Edison's genius. That great scene where Westinghouse is talking to his engineer. He wants AC, and the engineer said, it can't be done, and Westinghouse said, why do you say that? And the engineer says, because if it could be done, Edison would have done it already. So this is in the Capitalist Manifesto, I took it upon myself to rename the period. This is not the Gilded Age. Corruption exists everywhere all the time. That's not the defining essence of late 19th, turn of the 20th century America. The defining essence is inventiveness. It's the inventive period. There's all this tremendous outpouring of innovations. By the way, one last example. I didn't mention John Roebling, and the perfection of the suspension bridge and the building of his masterpiece, the Brooklyn Bridge, which was an engineering marvel in the 19th century. And here it is, like almost 140 years later. You know how much traffic the Brooklyn Bridge takes every day? Roebling designed that thing to last. It is amazing. It is amazing achievement. The inventive period, and right at the heart of it, turn of the 20th century, the maybe the pinnacle of it, the crowning success of it, taking the transportation revolution of Henry Ford, taking it higher and further, literally, are the Wright brothers. So how did these guys who had little schooling, high school at most, how did they do it?
Yeah, there's an interesting connection there too, because apparently the Wright brothers used some Roebling wire in one of their first flyers. So you have this amazing sort of mixture of the talents. You mentioned the connection between Ford and Edison, and there's Westinghouse and Edison, and of course J.P. Morgan's in the background here. But anyway, the context is just this, like you said, this beautiful period, the inventive age. And we've got these two brothers that grow up and they're inseparable, even from a young age. They live together, eat together, and play together. And some even say they thought together. And Will is the more serious of the two, even younger on, and Orville's a more cheerful kid. And but this interest, I think, is sparked from a really early age because their father brought home this toy made by this French toy maker, and it was a little helicopter. And they were fascinated by it and apparently started building their own, even in grade school. And they're growing up at a time where all this invention is happening, but it's still not really, it's not common for people to have running water and plumbing in their own homes. And that's their situation. No running water, no plumbing. Their meals had to be cooked on a wood stove. Um,
Wow.
but their father was super supportive of informal education. They had a very big book collection, despite the fact that the material conditions of their home were not great. They had Darwin's uh, uh, book on evolution. They had Plutarch's Lives. They had Thucydides' history and all sorts of great books that they loved to read, and some of them even on birds and just the way that birds flew through the air, the aerodynamics of them. So their father was supportive of them, even sometimes skipping school to stay home and read or work on their own projects.
Yeah, that's great. Especially, I didn't realize they had copy of Origin of Species in the family library. That's really it's really exceptional because their father was a bishop of some Protestant denomination or something, wasn't he? So it's great that he was so supportive of science and applied science and technology and inventiveness. Right. So
Yeah, absolutely.
that's yeah, that really is special. And, a few points I want to make it because on this on the Wright brothers' early life, because we've often remarked on the Hero Show, John, how some of these heroes will go on to do great things were not stellar students. When they were younger. Thomas Edison, for example, was kicked out of the fourth grade. The headmaster told Mrs. Edison that her son's brain was addled. That's funny. Young Tom Edison's brain was addled. But anyhow, Orville Wright was expelled from school once, according to my reading, and dropped out of high school. Yeah, so again, not like great students, in their formal schooling. And it also reminds me of an immortal line ascribed to Mark Twain, one of their contemporary, right, late 19th, turn of the 20th century intellectuals. But I think it was actually said by somebody previously, and Mark Twain picked it up, and that is, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." you know and now, in a free society and a private educational system, I think education would schooling would greatly enhance somebody's education, and sometimes it does. But sometimes schooling is more indoctrination, like today, than it is education. And I think, but the hard nugget of truth in that statement is that my schooling is not coextensive with my education. My schooling is not identical to my education. And the Wright brothers were autodidacts. They're really smart kids. They're readers, like you said. Their dad encouraged it. They had a personal library, and it was self-taught in aeronautical engineering. This is not unusual, in history. Well, like I said, Thomas Edison kicked out of the fourth grade. He did all right in electrical engineering later on, didn't he? And Ayn Rand had a bachelor's degree in history, and then she revolutionizes the fields of literature and philosophy. So this is not unusual. It's I guess it's rare, but it does happen, and it's tremendously praiseworthy. These kind of dedication these kind of autodidacts have. So they're working on
Yeah.
this project on their own in the back room of their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and so you want to pick up the story?
Yeah, and this reminds me too of something that another pioneer in aviation recently told me, Blake Scholl, who's the CEO and founder
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Boom Supersonic, pioneering
Boom.
commercially viable sonic flight. But he said, it's not credentials that matter, it's credibility. And I think that's absolutely right. And, it's not whether or not you got the degree or in the field or whatever. It's, can you do the work? And they could do the work. The Wrights could do the work.
Oh yeah.
And obviously
Oh
Scholl
yeah.
can too. He's making waves. So, but I
Yeah.
think, to pick up the
I agree.
story, it was actually back in high school. Well, Orville was still in high school. I think he was 17, and he had been uh, interning at a print shop and a printing press, and decided, here's a very entrepreneurial kid, decided to build his own printing press and start his own business. So he did that. They built the West Side News, he and his brother. And by the time Orville was like 21, he was already making pretty good money, making more than the engineers on trains and stuff were at the time. $2 to $3.25 a day. Of course, he was splitting that with his brother, so they weren't making that much. But there was this craze at the time of bicycles. It's kind of like, what could we compare that today? Maybe video games or something, but it was everybody was interested in bicycles, kids from the very young to the older people. And there were some naysayers like bicycles are going to corrupt people, the typical conservative arguments against any sort of innovation. But the Wright brothers got really interested in bicycles, opened their own bicycle shop in 1893, and there was a lot of competition because everybody was interested in bikes, and so they actually started building their own models. They had a couple. The Van Cleve was one of the first. It was I think around $65, and they had another cheaper model that they came out with after. And the most discerning of bicyclists loved their bikes. They were just absolutely excellent quality. They really were able to build up this business, and it got them through several years and built the capital that they needed to start experimenting with other things. But that that happened when Orville got typhoid fever in 1895 and was sick for over a month. And at the time, Wilbur was hanging around and sort of taking care of him, and he started reading these books on aviation. He read about Otto Lilienthal, a German glider pilot who had recently died, but Lilienthal really set a fire in the Wright brothers, and he said, "It is our duty not to rest until we have attained a perfect scientific conception of flight." And the Wrights shortly thereafter became missionaries in this quest to fly. So it's just, thereafter, they just dive right into learning about it.
Yeah, and it's like again, it's this classic American story. They did it independently, right? I mean, they had no government funding. I think Samuel Langley, another pioneer in the field, I think Samuel Langley had a lucrative government contract, but the Wright brothers didn't seek it, as far as I know, and they didn't have it. And it's and you can see why. Very often, what the government finances, the government controls, right? The government has to ensure that the project is done in accordance with their specifications. Whereas if you do it on your own time and your own dime, well, you do it according to your specifications. You do it according to your own judgment, independent of government regulators telling you what you got to do and what you can't do. So again, it's very American story. It really highlights Ayn Rand's theme when it illustrates Ayn Rand's theme in The Fountainhead on the virtue of independence and since the moral is the practical, this virtue leads to great practical results. So here they are. They got the wind tunnel. They built a wind tunnel in the back of their bicycle shop, didn't they? Where they conducted all kinds of experiments.
Yeah, they did that a couple years in. So they really in 1899, Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian asking for all the information that they had on flight, and Samuel P. Langley, the head of the Smithsonian Institution, actually a secretary there, sent him a bunch of information, and they started experimenting. And in 1900, Wilbur wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau and asked them, "Hey, what places in America have these certain conditions that would make this feasible?" And they wrote back, and Kitty Hawk was at the top of the list. And so in 1900, they made their way to Kitty Hawk, and it was quite the adventure. I mean, even just getting there was really dangerous at the time. Wilbur went first, and he got on a boat that almost sank, and finally got there, and they absolutely loved it. They loved the adventure, and but they weren't about taking unnecessary risks and doing things that were dangerous. They were all about being scientific about this whole thing, and about taking educated risks when necessary to practice and do what they needed to do. But yeah, in 1900, Wilbur gets his first taste of flying, and the following year in 1901, they had a terrible time. Mosquitoes, storms, really bad company that had come in, and we don't need to get into all the details of who was there, but people eating their food and taking their stuff. And then in 1901, they built this wind tunnel and really got scientific about the how to build the best uh, how to build the best wing, because it wasn't really known yet how to curve it, what's the right camber for the wing. And so they built this wind tunnel 6 feet long with a big fan on the end, and put a bunch of different uh, wing designs on pieces of metal that were hanging in there, and figured out, okay, which works best.
Yeah, and I think one of their innovations is they're the ones who focused on a reliable method of pilot control, to resolve the flying, what was known as the flying problem, whereas other engineers and designers and early aviators put more emphasis on developing powerful engines. And
Yeah.
there's one of their innovations that was important, that enabled them rather than somebody else to resolve this problem. There was, what was
Yeah, a
it,
lot of people were focused on the wrong things.
three axis control system, isn't that what they call it?
Yeah. Achieving equilibrium in the air, because people were interested, like, let's go fast, let's get power, let's do this, let's do that. The Wright brothers, they loved this. They loved to watch birds for hours on end and just learn from the birds. How is it that you fly? I mean, some of the people at Kitty Hawk thought they were crazy, because they'd sit out there and flap their arms and their wings, and they'd say, "Wow, they're able to do that. They look just like the birds." And they'd sit there and sketch the birds and sketch their wings and figure out how it was that they stayed stable in the air. But yeah, they saw this as a problem of multiple dimensions in physics, and they just had to figure out, okay, how to control each dimension. And that's what they were focused on, control.
All the power and speed. I mean, I'm a complete novice in this, but all the power and speed strikes me won't do you much good if you can't control the aircraft.
Yeah.
And you plunge to the ground. Wasn't that how the great German glider pilot you mentioned before, Otto Lilienthal? Isn't that how he died? And then said he couldn't control the glider, and it nosedived in a terrible crash and killed him. Wasn't that how Lilienthal died?
Yeah,
I think it
exactly.
was.
Yep. Broke his spine.
Uh, so the Wright brothers. Well, the Wright brothers, you have the benefit of when we had Professor Larry Gould on to discuss the great Isaac Newton. He quoted Newton about standing on the shoulders of giants, and the Wright brothers had the benefit of coming after Lilienthal and Lilienthal's tragic death, and learning from this. Pilot control is the key to manned, heavier than air flight. So, but
Yeah.
still,
Sure. Go ahead.
other people came after Lilienthal also, and it was the Wright brothers who learned the lesson, not anybody else. At least not at first.
Yeah, you mentioned Octave Chanute, and we've already mentioned Langley. And although they were the first to really solve this problem, they definitely looked up to these others, the engineers, the scientists, some of the people had done the math, had done the physics to figure out some of this stuff. They came not to trust a lot of that, because they figured out that, well, these people had never really been in the air, they'd never really practiced this stuff, and so they ended up doing a lot of their own calculations, a lot of their own math and engineering. But even Langley. So in 1903, Langley's in a race to. He announces in July 1903 that they're going to do the first man-powered flight, and this is a few months before the Wright brothers end up doing it. And his project had cost $50,000 in public money, and it goes up into the air and goes right down to the river. And people called it the submarine instead. So, um,
not a good nickname for an airplane, is it?
but it
It's
is
not funny.
dismissive and disdainful as the public reaction was. The Wright brothers felt bad for Langley, and they appreciated his contributions nonetheless. So, yeah,
Yeah,
they learned. They stood on the shoulders of giants, and they definitely learned from them, and never
right,
uh, were critical
right.
of them.
$50,000 in tax money. $50,000 in early 20th century was. I mean, if somebody wants to give me $50,000 today, I'd be glad to take it. was really a lot of money back then. But I'm always struck, John, by these heroes. I mean, like you said, they did a lot of trial and error, and you're right. They came to distrust a lot of the calculations, and they, based on trial and error, they reconfigured a lot of this. But here, these two high school, Orville high school graduate, these two high school graduates doing doing the math involved, and the physics and the engineering. I'm just so impressed by by that. That people, you don't have to go to Princeton, to get an education, and the Wright brothers figured it out. Trial and error and a great deal of thinking. These were geniuses. There's a great deal of thinking that goes into reconfiguring the math and the physics, and correcting the errors of previous engineers who were great minds in their own right. So I see why the Wright brothers have the reputation they have today. They really are a couple of giants in the field of aviation.
One of their friends in
So
Kitty Hawk, John Daniels, he said after he saw them fly, he said it wasn't luck that made them fly. It was hard work and common sense. They put their whole heart and soul and all their energy into an idea, and they had the faith. And he says faith. I think it was determination and grit, and those two terms were often used to describe them. But yeah, they were absolutely persistent. Earlier I called them missionaries in this quest for flight, and they really were. They were zealots about getting into the air and really flying confidently, like knowing what you're doing, not just getting up there and sort of flailing around like a lot of people had done, but just having complete control.
Right. Having that 3-axis control system this is a great achievement of engineering. So we set the scene. It's December 17th, 1903, 117 years ago. Here we are outside of Kitty Hawk, which is on the Outer Banks, isn't it, John? Isn't it that part of North Carolina? So it's December. I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know what the weather conditions were that day, but it's December on the Outer Banks, so I'm guessing it was cold and blustery. Okay, so here we are, and they take turns, don't they? The two brothers take turns, and they have four flights that day, as I recall. Is that right?
Yep, 4 flights, and I believe Orville goes up first. Yeah. So Wilbur tried 3 days earlier on December 14th, and he made a mistake there at the very end. They had a track that helped launch them, and Wilbur messed up. So it was Orville's turn to go, and he goes, and here we go.
So there we go. Nice. That's the first flight, right? Was Orville flying and Wilbur was running alongside on the first flight of the Wright flight? Was that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So those first flights were like 100 feet in 8 seconds or something, and they kept over time and over a period of years, they kept expanding it, to like 20 miles in 38 minutes, or something like those first flights on December 17th, 1903. They were like 100 feet or a few hundred feet. It was measured in several hundred feet and in seconds. But baby steps, right? Or maybe we should say baby flights. You don't get to the moon just from being on the ground. You got to get up in the air first, and then for a few seconds with a manned, powered, heavier than air craft. Then you started that journey.
They understood that the person who was going to figure out flying had to be somebody who lived a long time. You couldn't just be this daredevil and end up, killing yourself at a young age. It had to be somebody who understood all of the variables involved and then practiced a lot. So yeah, baby flights. Orville Wright, 120 feet in 12 seconds. A lot of people asked him, so were you scared? He's like, scared? There was no time to be scared. It was 12 seconds.
And I'm not sure how high off the ground they got on those first flights, but it wasn't very high, was it? From the photograph, it's not even over Wilbur's head. I don't know if it's just taking off here or if this is the
Yeah, that was
actual.
taken right as he passed the end of the track that helped launch them. I think he got a little higher than that, but they weren't going for height. They were like they were going for control
Right,
still and straight on
right.
flights. I think Wilbur ended up doing a 1/4 mile flight at the end of that day before a gust of wind. Well, he was already on the ground, but a gust of wind grabbed their flyer and smashed it to pieces and ended up hurting their friend. It caught their friend John Daniels, and um, but they got 4 flights in and became the first people to fly a motorized plane in history before they had to call it in for the year.
Excuse me, a historic moment in the history of aviation, in the history of what will develop later on into aerospace, and a historic moment in American history. You think about it. If I could jump ahead for a second here, John, because we celebrated Chuck Yeager last week, and properly so. As the first man to sound barrier break the sound barrier with broken ribs. That was 1947. So, in 44 years, from Kitty Hawk, a 120-foot flight, I don't know, 10 feet off the ground, to breaking the sound barrier in the X1. But the thing that really staggers me is, July 20th, 1969, the Eagle has landed. Apollo 11 lands on the moon. In 60 years from Kitty to the moon. This used to be a great country, man. 66 years from Kitty Hawk to the moon. That is just outstanding, and we are going to celebrate some of the heroes of the U.S. space program in the fullness of time. But yeah, 66 years from Kitty Hawk to the moon. That is just astonishing. And the Wright brothers set it all in motion.
Absolutely. They turned flying into a science. Kind of like it reminds me of Benjamin Franklin. He found electricity a hobby and a pastime of some of the wealthy people that had time to play, and he turned it into a science. And the Wright brothers did the same thing with flight. They took it from this pastime that people were just doing when they could, and they turned it into something that people could use confidently, really conquer the air. And that's where they were called when later we'll talk about when they were in France, but they also garnered quite the reputation, much like Franklin too. So there's a couple parallels there.
Right. And speaking of French, now the good news here, the French had a number of the French were avidly interested in aeronautics and flying. The bad news is they didn't believe the Wright brothers, and then they call them I forget the name they call it, but that they were charlatans, they were liars, liars or flyers, right? That they were liars and they weren't telling the truth about it. So what happened? What happened? They finally convinced the French in some form, didn't they?
Very dramatically, yeah. So the Wright brothers, patriotic Ohioans, Daytonians, and they really wanted to get the U.S. government interested in their plane so they could contract and make something of all this work they had done. But they were just repeatedly rebuffed, and so finally the French were actually coming over to see the Wright brothers after Kitty Hawk. They set up shop there in Dayton at Huffman's Prairie, and for several years they just continued to improve their flyer. They're testing, building new designs. But so the French took an interest, and the Wrights actually ended up going to France. Actually, Wilbur did to basically try to strike a deal with either a private buyer or the French government. But the deals sort of just kept stalling, and there are these priority disputes about who was really the first to fly, even though the Wrights had, documentation. They had photos of them in their flyer back on December 17th. But, now in 1908, it's been years, and the Wrights really haven't done any big public demonstrations. I mean, they had been doing them at Huffman's Prairie, but the press was just non-existent. They just didn't care. Even the press there in Dayton, they weren't coming to see the Wrights and popularize the story. They just turned a blind eye to it. So the French had picked up that story. That was what they believed, that these guys were a bunch of bluffers. So it wasn't until August 8th, 1908, that Wilbur, they got a plane over there. It was damaged in shipping. He took a while to fix it and finally was able to demonstrate. And he did a 2-minute flight. But after that, it was just known. Everybody in the world knew that the Wright brothers had flown first because they flew the best. He was able to do a turn, come back, land perfectly. Everything was totally smooth. People understood finally that they really had, they really were the first in flight, and they really had turned it into a science. They really understood what was going on.
Well, if you can convince the French, you can convince anybody, right? I just coined a phrase. But
They
yeah,
sure did. Yeah.
yeah, that's a great part of their story. Tragically, of course, Wilbur died so young, just a few years later from typhoid fever. But Orville continues the business, the family business of. Did they make money? I mean, on the airplane, I think
Yeah.
they did start an aviation company, didn't they? And manufacture
Yep,
planes.
they sure did. So after they did the demonstrations, there was a part of the contract where Wilbur had to train several other pilots there in France, and he did, and this became just an establishment in France for months. He was flying almost every other day, and royalty came, and many princes and princesses even went up in the air with him, and then, meanwhile, though, just a month after Wilbur's famous flight in France, Orville was over in the U.S. demonstrating for the U.S. government, and he was in Fort Myers Field, I believe, in Virginia. And he did a couple. He actually did some incredible flights. He broke many records. At one point, went for something dozen or so miles. He was up in the air for over an hour. But
Wow.
on September 17th, Thomas Selfridge, this guy that Orville really didn't like too much, got in the plane with him, and he was much heavier than any of his previous passengers. And unfortunately, they nosedived, and Selfridge died, and Orville ended up in the hospital for a while. But he recuperated. His sister Catherine was a huge help to both the brothers, and she was there in Washington to help him recuperate. And anyway, they ended up demonstrating on both sides of the Atlantic what they were capable of, and were able to get the company off the ground and to start signing contracts. I know that by the time that Wilbur left France, he came home with $200,000. So that was
Nice. That's a
pretty good
lot of
money back
money.
then.
That's a
Yeah.
lot of money. I mean, like I said, I'd be happy to have $200,000 today. That was certainly a lot of money 100 years ago. And remember the history here, because I wrote on this briefly in the Capitalist Manifesto. I think J.P. Morgan invested at some point in their company. Did any? I know Morgan had bankrolled Thomas Edison years earlier, and he was fascinated by these kind of innovations. Didn't he help fund the Wright brothers?
Could be. I
At
know
one point.
earlier on they actually refused funding. Octave Chanute, this French American engineer, and said, "Hey, I've got this friend J.P. Morgan that would love to fund you guys, and you could do this full time instead of selling your bicycles." And they rebuffed that. They were, they wanted to keep this totally, because earlier you mentioned you're when you get funding from somebody, you're sort of beholden to them. If you're working for the government, you're working for the government. But at least early on, they were all about doing this independently, and they got most of their money from actually contracts to build planes and to train flyers for them. But I wouldn't doubt
Yeah,
if later on Morgan did, and perhaps that was in
invest.
1918
Might have been.
Orville sold the company, so it might have been after that.
I don't remember what year. I don't remember what year Morgan died, but it was around the time of World War One. But he might have invested. Yeah, let me retract that. He might have invested in their project. I know he was interested, like you said, and that's a good point. Even when you get private funding, your account, it's not the government who can't legally. Private investors can't legally restrict you, but they have a say. They have their money's invested, so they have morally they have a say in how that money is spent. So if you can do it all independently, running your bicycle shop and then doing your experiments at night or on Sundays or whatever, it is. Ayn Rand is right. Howard Roark in The Fountainhead is absolutely right. That is the way to go. You're answerable then only to your own judgment and your own conscience. And that's how the Wright brothers proceeded.
Always, that's a big thing that we haven't hit on yet, was just how independent they were. They'd have crowds of thousands of people, and it was royalty, like we mentioned. In America, it was senators. William Howard Taft came to see Orville fly, but they wouldn't fly if it wasn't the conditions weren't right in their judgment. It didn't matter how many people or how illustrious they were. In fact, one of the senators, when Orville decided to put the plane away one day instead of flying, even though there was a huge crowd of people there, the senator said, "I'm damned if I don't admire their independence. We don't mean anything to them. There are a whole lot of reasons why we shouldn't." He's absolutely right. Like, it shouldn't matter. Your life is on the line. They follow their own judgment every time.
Yeah, U.S. Senate. Can you imagine Chuck Schumer saying that today?
Absolutely not. Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. So there we go. Now there is a photograph for the ages. Right?
Yeah. So those is that one on the podcast. This is Wilbur circling the Statue of Liberty.
Wow.
Yeah, in 1909, he was contracted to fly in a celebration of the 300th anniversary of coming up the Hudson, essentially, and establishing New York. And so he flew over the Hudson River.
Henry Hudson sailed up. All right. The river that has his name. And here's Wilbur Wright, 300 years later, flying the Wright fly around the Statue of Liberty. Well, country had changed a little bit in 300 years, but yeah, these are the pioneers, the great pioneers, the giants upon whose shoulders the field of aviation certainly rests. Was there anything else on the Wright brothers that we wanted to touch upon today, John?
Well, you mentioned that Will died pretty young. He died at 45, actually earlier than his hero Otto Lilienthal died of typhoid. And Orville kept going, though. He wanted to fly for the rest of his life. And in 1918, he decided to sell the Wright Flyer Company and open a laboratory. But in 1918 as well, his lingering pain from his earlier crash kept him from flying. He saw the planes in action in wars, and he wasn't happy about that. But he never regretted what they did. He knew that he compared it to fire. He said you can use fire for good things and for bad. You can use flight for good things or for bad. And I don't think he fully understood how good it was for us to use flight to conquer over some of the ideologies that were then reigning in Europe. But,
right. That's what I was going to say. When you create these new technologies that could be made into powerful weapons of war, you want to make sure the free countries. You want to make sure the free countries have them, because the dictators will certainly beg, borrow, or steal, and then use it to murder millions of innocent people. So you're right. Allied control and Orville died in 1948, so that's post World War II. Come to think of it, John, that's post Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier. It is the following year. I just thought of that. I just thought that must have made him happy. But on D-Day, on June 6, 1944, Allied control of the skies was important to the success of that invasion, and ultimately being able to defeat the National Socialists or Nazis. And of course, American air power in the Cold War was one of the things, and using that technology to go further, in rocketry and everything, as American air power had played a decisive role, I think, in keeping the Soviet Union from invading and conquering Western Europe. Although that's speculation because it didn't happen. But you're right. This technology in the hands of the free countries is invaluable in defeating the totalitarian ideologies. Absolutely. And
One of
getting
the
to the
great
moon.
quotes from Wilbur and Orville was the best dividends on the labor invested have invariably come from seeking more knowledge rather than more power. And I think that applies in more ways than they realized.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And when we discuss the U.S. space program at some point in the future, the Mercury program, we can do a whole show, Mercury program, the Gemini program, and then the Apollo program. Well, I'm lucky enough to have lived through that and been, I was young, very young, during the days of the Mercury program, but fascinated by, even at 9 years old, I realized this was much more important than anything that I could possibly study in school, and I stayed home to watch it. When we discuss the U.S. space program, we will go back to the beginnings and credit, the great heroes of aviation. And there's nobody more heroic in the field of aviation than the Wright brothers. So, uh, any last words on this, John, before we sign off for the day?
Well, it's just such a beautiful story, and I find it super inspiring. I hope you guys do too. If you want more on this story, David McCullough wrote a book called The Wright Brothers, and it's just a beautifully written book, and I'd advise everyone to check it out.
And David McCullough is great. I mean, he's a real hero worshiper. His book on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, was it the Great Bridge, I think is the name of it, is excellent. On the building of the Panama Canal, was it The Path Between the Seas? He captures the heroic spirit, of these achievements. So yeah, David McCullough's books, and certainly the one on the Wright brothers, highly recommended. Well, all right then. It is an inspiring story. I hope everybody out there is as inspired as John and I are. I'm going to salute John. I'm going to salute the great Wright brothers, and I'm going to wish you to have a heroic day. And the same to everybody else out there in Hero Land. Have a heroic day, everybody.